She was a decorated Alabama policewoman, respected, trusted, admired by everyone in Millbrook County. Officer Sarah Mitchell had dedicated 15 years of her life to protecting and serving her community, rising through the ranks with unwavering determination and an impeccable record. But when her body was found in her own bedroom on a cold November morning, covered in 17 brutal stab wounds, suspicion quickly fell on someone nobody expected: the sheriff's own teenage son. The same boy she had been secretly mentoring, the same boy who had lost his mother just months earlier, the same boy whose father held the highest law enforcement position in the county. What dark secret led to this bloody end? And why did the people sworn to uphold the law fight hardest to bury the truth? Tonight, we uncover a story that will shake your faith in justice itself, where badges meant nothing and blood ran thicker than the law. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This isn't just another murder case. This is a story that asks the questions that will haunt you long after this video ends. Who really killed Sarah Mitchell? Was the relationship between a 38-year-old decorated police officer and a grieving 17-year-old boy something innocent that turned deadly? Or was there something far more complex beneath the surface? How far would Sheriff Thomas Brandon go to protect his family's reputation, and what price was he willing to pay to keep his son's secrets buried? As we peel back the layers of this case, you'll discover that in small-town Alabama, where everyone knows everyone and secrets don't stay hidden for long, the truth becomes a weapon that can destroy lives. The evidence will shock you, the testimonies will conflict in ways that seem impossible, and by the end of this story, you'll have to decide for yourself. Was this justice, or was this corruption at its darkest? To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to go back to the beginning. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any police officer. Born and raised in Millbrook County, she had joined the force straight out of college with dreams of making her community safer. Her colleagues describe her as meticulous, fair, and absolutely incorruptible. She had never married, dedicating her life entirely to her career and her elderly parents. Those who knew her say she was lonely, perhaps searching for the family she never had, but she channeled that longing into protecting others. Officer Mitchell lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, the same house she had inherited from her grandmother. Neighbors describe her as friendly but private, someone who kept to herself but would always lend a helping hand. She had a routine that rarely varied: work, gym, grocery store, and home by 8 o'clock every evening. She was the kind of person who triple-checked her locks, kept emergency numbers by her phone, and never ever let strangers into her house after dark. Then there was Daniel Brandon, the sheriff's son. 17 years old, a junior at Millbrook High School, and still reeling from the loss of his mother to cancer 8 months earlier. Teachers describe him as a bright but troubled kid who had gone from honor roll student to barely passing after his mother's death. His father, Sheriff Thomas Brandon, was a 30-year veteran of law enforcement, respected but stern, the kind of man who believed in discipline and order above all else. After his wife's death, the relationship between father and son had become strained, filled with unspoken grief and mounting tension. The connection between Sarah and Daniel began innocently enough. Sheriff Brandon had approached Officer Mitchell about teaching a self-defense class for teenagers at the community center. Sarah had volunteered her time, wanting to give back to the community that had supported her throughout her career. Daniel was one of 12 teenagers in that first class, held every Thursday evening in the community center gym. According to other participants, Sarah took a special interest in Daniel, perhaps recognizing in him the same pain she had felt when she lost her own mother years earlier. But somewhere in those Thursday evening classes, something changed. Witnesses recall seeing Sarah and Daniel talking privately after the other students had left. These conversations, initially lasting just a few minutes, gradually extended to 30 minutes, then an hour. Other teenagers in the class noticed that Daniel seemed happier, more engaged when Officer Mitchell was around. What started as a mentor-student relationship was evolving into something that would ultimately cost Sarah Mitchell her life. The first signs that something was wrong came from Sarah's partner, Officer James Conway. He noticed changes in Sarah's behavior starting in late September. She had become secretive, taking personal phone calls during work hours and stepping away from her desk to answer them. She had started leaving work exactly at 5 o'clock, something she had never done in her 15-year career. Most concerning of all, she had begun asking Conway to cover for her during certain shifts, claiming she had personal appointments she couldn't reschedule. When Conway pressed her for details, Sarah would become evasive, changing the subject or finding urgent paperwork that suddenly needed her attention. October 15th started like any other day for Sarah Mitchell. Security cameras at the police station show her arriving at 7:47 a.m., carrying her usual coffee and breakfast sandwich. She spent the morning processing reports from the previous night's calls, attended a brief staff meeting at 10:30 a.m., and had lunch at her desk while reviewing case files. According to Officer Conway, Sarah seemed normal throughout the day, perhaps slightly distracted, but nothing that raised any immediate concerns. She left work at exactly 5 p.m., telling Conway she had some errands to run and would see him the next morning. Grocery store receipts show that Sarah stopped at Miller's Market at 5:23 p.m., purchasing ingredients for what appeared to be dinner for two steaks, fresh vegetables, a bottle of wine, and a chocolate cake from the bakery section. The cashier, Mary Ellen Thompson, who had known Sarah for years, later testified that this was unusual. Sarah typically bought simple meals for one, usually pre-made salads or frozen dinners. When Mary Ellen commented on the festive purchase, Sarah simply smiled and said she was expecting a friend for dinner. Sarah's neighbor, elderly Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, was watering her garden around 6:45 p.m. when she saw a young man walking up to Sarah's front door. Mrs. Fletcher, who knew everyone in the neighborhood, didn't recognize the visitor, but noted that Sarah answered the door quickly, as if she had been expecting him. Through her kitchen window, Mrs. Fletcher could see that the lights were on in Sarah's dining room throughout the evening, and she occasionally heard what sounded like conversation and laughter. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Mrs. Fletcher noticed that the house had gone quiet and the dining room lights had been turned off. What happened next would change everything. At approximately 11:47 p.m., Mrs. Fletcher was awakened by what she describes as blood-curdling screams coming from Sarah's house. The screams, clearly female, lasted for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Mrs. Fletcher immediately called 911, but by the time emergency responders arrived 12 minutes later, the house was silent and dark. Police officers found the front door unlocked and Sarah Mitchell's body in her bedroom. The scene was unlike anything the Millbrook County Police Department had ever encountered. Sarah lay on her bedroom floor, still wearing the blue dress she had worn to work that day, but now it was soaked in blood. She had been stabbed 17 times, with wounds concentrated on her chest, neck, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms. The medical examiner later determined that the attack had been frenzied, personal, and brutal. Someone had wanted Sarah Mitchell to suffer. The evidence told a story of a struggle that had begun in the bedroom and ended there. A bedside lamp lay shattered on the floor, its shade torn and its base cracked. Sarah's jewelry box had been overturned, spilling its contents across the dresser, but nothing appeared to be missing. A half-empty wine glass sat on the nightstand, and forensic analysis would later reveal it contained Sarah's lipstick and fingerprints, along with traces of the wine she had purchased earlier that evening. On the bedroom floor, investigators found something that would become crucial evidence. A small piece of fabric, dark blue and expensive, torn as if it had been ripped from someone's clothing during the struggle. But perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the crime scene was what investigators found in the kitchen. The dinner Sarah had prepared had been partially eaten by two people. 2 plates, 2 wine glasses, 2 sets of silverware, all bearing fingerprints and DNA evidence that would eventually lead investigators to their prime suspect. The kitchen showed no signs of struggle, suggesting that whatever had gone wrong, it had happened later in the evening, possibly in the bedroom itself. And when detectives pulled evidence from under her fingernails, the truth began to unravel in ways that shocked the entire town. If you're still watching, drop a comment with Alabama. Let's see who's following every twist. News of Sarah Mitchell's murder spread through Millbrook County like wildfire. By morning, the police station was overwhelmed with phone calls from citizens demanding answers. How could something like this happen to one of their most respected police officers? Who would want to hurt someone who had dedicated her life to protecting others? The local newspaper ran a front-page story with Sarah's academy graduation photo under the headline, "Hero Fallen, Beloved Officer Murdered in Her Own Home." Sheriff Thomas Brandon took personal control of the investigation, assigning his most experienced detectives to the case and promising the community that justice would be swift and thorough. But from the very beginning, there were irregularities in how the investigation was handled. Detective Lisa Martinez, who had worked with Sarah for over a decade, was mysteriously removed from the case after just 2 days, officially due to her emotional involvement with the victim. Detective Martinez later claimed that she had been making significant progress in analyzing the evidence and was confused by her sudden removal. The first major breakthrough came from the forensic analysis of the evidence found under Sarah's fingernails. Along with skin tissue that would later be matched through DNA testing, investigators found fibers that appeared to come from an expensive piece of clothing, possibly a sweater or jacket. The lab also discovered traces of a specific cologne, a high-end brand not commonly found in Millbrook County. These clues suggested that Sarah's attacker was someone she knew well enough to let into her home, someone who had been close enough to her during the struggle to leave behind such detailed evidence. As investigators began interviewing Sarah's colleagues, friends, and neighbors, a pattern began to emerge. Several people mentioned seeing Sarah with a young man in recent weeks, though descriptions were vague and often contradictory. Mrs. Fletcher provided the most detailed account of the visitor she had seen on the night of the murder, describing him as tall, slender, with dark hair, and wearing what appeared to be a dark blue jacket. When shown photos of various young men from the community, including students from the self-defense class, Mrs. Fletcher's identification would prove to be the turning point in the case. But it was Sarah's personal belongings that provided the most shocking evidence. Hidden in her bedroom closet, investigators found a small box containing items that painted a picture none of them were prepared for. Inside were handwritten letters, dozens of them, written in a teenage boy's handwriting and signed simply with the initial D. The letters were intimate, romantic, and increasingly desperate in tone. They spoke of secret meetings, forbidden love, and growing frustration with having to hide their relationship from the world. The letters revealed a relationship that had begun as innocent mentorship but had evolved into something far more complex and troubling. The earliest letters, dated just weeks after the self-defense classes had begun, were sweet and grateful, thanking Sarah for her kindness during a difficult time. But as the months progressed, the letters became more passionate, speaking of love and plans for a future together. The most recent letters, written in the weeks before Sarah's death, showed signs of increasing anxiety and jealousy, with the writer begging Sarah not to end their relationship and promising that he would do anything to keep her in his life. Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. The letters had been written by Daniel Brandon, the sheriff's own son. Phone records supported this theory, showing numerous calls between Sarah's personal cell phone and a number registered to Daniel Brandon in the weeks leading up to her death. Text messages, many of which had been deleted but were recovered through digital forensics, painted a picture of a relationship that had become increasingly complicated and potentially dangerous. The most damaging evidence came from Sarah's personal diary, found hidden beneath her mattress. In her own handwriting, Sarah had documented her growing concern about her relationship with Daniel, describing it as inappropriate and something that needs to end. Her final entry, dated just 3 days before her death, revealed her intention to speak with Sheriff Brandon about his son's behavior and to potentially transfer away from Millbrook County to escape the situation she had allowed to develop. The community was divided in their reaction to these revelations. Some refused to believe that their respected Officer Mitchell could have been involved in an inappropriate relationship with a teenage boy. Others questioned whether the evidence was real or if it had been planted to frame an innocent young man. But as more details emerged, it became clear that the relationship between Sarah Mitchell and Daniel Brandon was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. At Sarah's funeral, held on a gray October morning at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, the entire law enforcement community turned out to pay their respects. Sheriff Brandon delivered a eulogy that praised Sarah's service and dedication, never once mentioning the investigation that was tearing his family apart. But it was what happened after the service that convinced investigators they were on the right track. As mourners filed past Sarah's grave to pay their final respects, Daniel Brandon placed something into the ground that made detectives realize this case was far from simple. What Daniel Brandon placed in Sarah Mitchell's grave was a silver ring with 2 initials engraved on the inside, SMDB Forever. The ring, which had belonged to Daniel's deceased mother, had been modified by a local jeweler just weeks before Sarah's murder. When confronted with this evidence, the jeweler, Robert Hayes, confirmed that Daniel had brought the ring to him in early September, asking to have the original inscription removed and replaced with the new one. According to Hayes, Daniel had seemed nervous and emotional, explaining that the ring was for someone very special who had helped him through a difficult time. The ring provided investigators with the final piece of evidence they needed to obtain an arrest warrant for Daniel Brandon. But the arrest, which should have been straightforward, became complicated when Sheriff Brandon refused to allow his officers to arrest his own son. Instead, he insisted on bringing Daniel in himself, claiming it was his responsibility as both the sheriff and the boy's father. This decision would later be questioned by state investigators, who wondered whether Sheriff Brandon was protecting his son or ensuring that evidence was handled properly. The autopsy results, released 2 weeks after Sarah's death, revealed additional details that painted an even more complex picture of what had happened that night. The medical examiner determined that Sarah had fought desperately for her life, evidenced by the numerous defensive wounds on her hands and arms. The stab wounds were consistent with someone using a kitchen knife, possibly one taken from Sarah's own kitchen during the struggle. Most significantly, the examiner found evidence that suggested the attack had been personal and emotional rather than random or calculated. Under questioning, Daniel Brandon initially denied any romantic relationship with Officer Mitchell, claiming they were simply friends and that she had been helping him cope with his mother's death. But when confronted with the letters, phone records, and physical evidence found at the crime scene, his story began to fall apart. His attorney, hired immediately by Sheriff Brandon, advised Daniel to remain silent, but the young man seemed desperate to explain himself, to make people understand that what had happened wasn't what it appeared to be. The community reaction to Daniel's arrest was swift and divided. Supporters of the Brandon family organized rallies outside the courthouse, claiming that Daniel was being made a scapegoat in a case that investigators couldn't solve. They argued that a grieving teenager was being unfairly targeted because of his family connection to law enforcement. Others, particularly those who had known and worked with Sarah Mitchell, demanded justice for a woman they believed had been murdered by someone she had tried to help. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. During a search of Sarah's police locker, investigators found files that she had been secretly compiling for months. These files contained evidence of corruption within the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, including falsified arrest reports, mishandled evidence, and financial irregularities that pointed directly to Sheriff Brandon himself. The files suggested that Sarah had been building a case against her own department, possibly preparing to turn the evidence over to state authorities. The discovery of these files changed everything about the case. Suddenly, the motive for Sarah's murder wasn't just about a forbidden relationship gone wrong. It was about a police officer who had discovered corruption at the highest levels of her department and was preparing to expose it. The question became whether Daniel Brandon had killed Sarah Mitchell out of passion and jealousy, or whether his father had somehow orchestrated the murder to protect himself from exposure. Was Sarah Mitchell killed because she was going to end her relationship with a teenage boy, or because she was about to destroy Sheriff Brandon's career and reputation? As the investigation deepened, more evidence emerged that suggested Sheriff Brandon's involvement in covering up his department's crimes. Financial records showed unexplained income and suspicious transactions that coincided with cases that had been mysteriously dropped or mishandled. Witnesses came forward claiming they had seen Sheriff Brandon meeting with known criminals in secluded locations. Most damaging of all, a fellow police officer from a neighboring county revealed that Sarah had contacted him just days before her death, asking for advice about how to report corruption within her own department. Was she a victim of forbidden love, or was she silenced because she knew too much? And what role did the sheriff himself play in covering it all up? The trial of Daniel Brandon began on a cold February morning, 6 months after Sarah Mitchell's murder. The courthouse was packed with reporters, law enforcement officers, and community members, all eager to finally learn the truth about what had happened on that terrible night. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rebecca Torres, presented a case built on physical evidence, DNA analysis, and the romantic correspondence between Daniel and Sarah. They painted a picture of an obsessed teenager who had killed the woman he claimed to love when she tried to end their inappropriate relationship. The defense, however, presented a very different story. Daniel's attorney, Marcus Webb, argued that his client was being framed for a murder he didn't commit. According to the defense, the real killer was someone with far more to lose than a heartbroken teenager. Webb pointed to the corruption files found in Sarah's locker and suggested that Sheriff Brandon himself had orchestrated his son's arrest to deflect attention from his own crimes. The ring found in Sarah's grave, Webb argued, had been planted there by Sheriff Brandon to strengthen the case against his son. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Sheriff Brandon took the witness stand. Under direct examination, he appeared to be the grieving father of a troubled boy, steadfastly maintaining his son's innocence while acknowledging the inappropriate relationship that had developed between Daniel and Officer Mitchell. But under cross-examination, cracks began to show in his testimony. When confronted with the corruption evidence found in Sarah's locker, Sheriff Brandon claimed ignorance, insisting that he had no knowledge of any investigation Sarah might have been conducting. But it was Daniel Brandon's testimony that truly shocked the courtroom. Against his attorney's advice, Daniel insisted on taking the witness stand to tell his side of the story. Through tears, he admitted to the romantic relationship with Sarah Mitchell, describing it as the only bright spot in his life after his mother's death. He spoke of Sarah with genuine affection, calling her kind and understanding, someone who had made him feel less alone in the world. But when asked about the night of Sarah's murder, Daniel's testimony took an unexpected turn. He admitted to being at Sarah's house that evening, confirming Mrs. Fletcher's identification and explaining the dinner they had shared. According to Daniel, Sarah had invited him over to tell him that their relationship needed to end, that she had realized it was wrong and potentially harmful to both of them. Daniel claimed he had accepted her decision, understanding that she was trying to protect them both. However, Daniel's version of events diverged dramatically from the prosecution's theory when he described what happened next. According to his testimony, Sarah had received a phone call around 11:30 p.m. that had visibly upset her. Daniel claimed he couldn't hear the entire conversation, but he heard Sarah say, "I won't be intimidated, and I have copies of everything." After the call ended, Sarah had asked Daniel to leave immediately, saying it wasn't safe for him to be there. Daniel testified that he had left through the back door, as Sarah had requested, but had hidden in the backyard when he saw a car pull up to the front of the house. From his hiding spot, he claimed to have seen a man enter through the front door, someone Sarah apparently knew and had let inside. Daniel said he waited in the backyard for nearly an hour, too frightened to leave, until he heard Sarah scream. By the time he worked up the courage to look through the bedroom window, he claimed, Sarah was already dead and the killer was gone. The most explosive part of Daniel's testimony came when he was asked why he hadn't called the police immediately. Through tears, Daniel admitted that he had panicked, realizing that his presence at the scene would make him the prime suspect. But more shocking still was his claim that when he had finally worked up the courage to call 911, he had been stopped by a call from his father. According to Daniel, Sheriff Brandon had somehow learned about the murder before it was officially reported and had ordered his son to come home immediately without calling for help. This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and raised serious questions about Sheriff Brandon's involvement in the case. If Daniel's testimony was true, it meant that Sheriff Brandon had knowledge of Sarah's murder before anyone else and had actively prevented his son from reporting the crime. The implications were staggering. Either Daniel was lying to save himself, or Sheriff Brandon had been involved in Sarah's murder from the very beginning. The prosecution's response was swift and brutal. They argued that Daniel's testimony was a desperate attempt to shift blame to his father, a man who had dedicated his life to law enforcement and public service. They pointed out that there was no evidence of the mysterious phone call Daniel claimed Sarah had received, no proof of another visitor to the house, and no explanation for how Sheriff Brandon could have known about the murder before it was reported. The physical evidence, they maintained, clearly pointed to Daniel Brandon as Sarah Mitchell's killer. But the defense had one final surprise. In the closing days of the trial, they presented evidence that Sheriff Brandon had made several suspicious phone calls on the night of Sarah's murder, including one to a number that had been traced to a known criminal informant. They also revealed that Sheriff Brandon had been seen at a location near Sarah's house around the time of the murder, contradicting his alibi that he had been home all evening. As the jury deliberated, the community of Millbrook County held its breath. The case had exposed corruption, inappropriate relationships, and questions about justice that would haunt the town for years to come. When the verdict finally came, it satisfied no one and left more questions than answers. Daniel Brandon was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, a compromise verdict that suggested the jury believed he had killed Sarah Mitchell, but had been provoked or acted in the heat of passion rather than with premeditation. In the end, the truth may never be fully known. A dedicated police officer lost her life, a young man lost his innocence and his freedom, and a community lost its faith in the institutions meant to protect them. Sheriff Brandon resigned in disgrace, though he was never formally charged with any crime related to Sarah's death or the corruption she had been investigating. The files Sarah had compiled disappeared from evidence, and the investigation into departmental corruption was quietly closed. As we conclude this tragic story, we're left with more questions than answers. Sarah Mitchell was buried in Millbrook County Cemetery on a hill overlooking the town she had served so faithfully. Her grave is visited regularly by former colleagues and community members who remember her as a dedicated officer who died too young. Daniel Brandon was sentenced to 15 years in prison, though he maintains his innocence to this day. Sheriff Thomas Brandon moved away from Millbrook County shortly after his resignation and has never spoken publicly about the case. The corruption Sarah Mitchell died trying to expose was never fully investigated. The files she had compiled were deemed inconclusive by state authorities, and no charges were ever filed against anyone in the sheriff's department. The community of Millbrook County slowly healed, but the scars remain visible to those who knew the truth about what really happened in that small Alabama town. What do you think really happened that night? Was Daniel Brandon a killer driven by obsession and jealousy, or was he a pawn in a larger game of corruption and cover-up? Was Sarah Mitchell killed because she tried to end an inappropriate relationship, or because she threatened to expose the dark secrets of those sworn to protect the law? How far would a father go to protect his son, and how far would a corrupt sheriff go to protect himself? The truth, as it often does, lies somewhere in the shadows between what we know and what we can prove. In a case where badges meant nothing and blood was thicker than justice, perhaps the real tragedy is not just that Sarah Mitchell died, but that we may never know why. What do you think really happened that night? Was it love, corruption, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story shocked you, wait until you hear what happened when a small-town mayor tried to expose his own police chief's darkest secrets. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and remember, in the world of true crime, The truth is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction.